This was the moment when Iranian Revolutionary Guard commandos arrived by helicopter to board a container ship. A seaman filming this can be heard warning his crew not to go outside.
Hey, things up, don't come out. Hey, things up.
The MSC Ares is linked to an Israeli billionaire, and it had turned off its tracking data for safety. But the Iranians were looking for revenge, and they found it here in the Gulf, ratcheting up tension with Israel.
Iran will bear the consequences for choosing to escalate the situation any further. Israel is on high alert. We have increased our readiness to protect Israel from further Iranian aggression. We are also prepared to respond.
Iran has repeatedly vowed to avenge this Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Syria last week, which killed 7 Revolutionary Guard commanders. President Biden is returning to the White House early from his weekend break, believing that such an attack could be imminent.
My expectation sooner than later.
Mr. President, to Iran in this moment.
Don't.
Allahu Akbar.
Ayatollah Khamenei seems to be listening, because his diplomats are talking privately of a limited response so as not to spark a wider war. Though we don't yet know if the seizure of a ship is that relatively restrained reprisal or just the beginning. American spy satellites will be busy monitoring any movement of Iranian missile launchers. A pro-Iranian militia in Iraq claims it fired these towards Israel a few days ago, though apparently without reaching their targets. The question is whether Iran will risk a direct attack on Israel itself, using the largest arsenal of missiles and drones in the Middle East. Its missiles can fly over 1,200 miles, far enough to hit Israel, as can its drones, with the advantage of flying low to avoid radar. Then there's the so-called axis of resistance at Iran's disposal. The Houthis in Yemen, who've been attacking shipping since November. Armed militias in Syria and Iraq who've killed American troops, as well as Hezbollah militants on the other side of Israel's border with Lebanon. Those militants say they launched dozens of rockets and drones last night in what has become a regular exchange of fire, though Hezbollah's leader indicated last week that Iran would also respond directly.
You can be certain that the Iranian response to the targeting of the consulate in Damascus is definitely coming against Israel.
This ship and its crew of 25 are being taken into Iranian territorial waters, and the world's been reminded of Iran's chokehold over global trade. But Iran has carried out operations like this before, and so far this is not the barrage of missiles on Israel which the Americans have been predicting.
Well, Ali Ansari is a professor of Iranian history and founding director of the Institute for Iranian Studies at St Andrews University. Thanks very much for coming in. There was always going to be some form of retaliation, but what do you think is the thinking behind this particular move?
Well, I think there's clearly tensions in the regime at the moment between those who want a more maximalist response and those who want something more limited. This would certainly fall in the more limited response, but what I'm reading in the sort of Iranian media is that this is actually it's nothing to do with the response that they're planning against Israel.
Right, so the United States has been warning repeatedly that there would be some sort of attack on Iran, by Iran on Israel. Yes. So it's not likely, in your view, that this attack is the end of it? No,
I mean, certainly not the way they're presenting it in Iran. I do think they are facing something of a dilemma in Iran about what to do. Obviously, there's been this sort of suggestion that they're planning a sort of a mass barrage of drones and other missiles into Israel itself. But I suspect there are some people in Iran that are a bit worried about what the consequences of that might be.
Now, even if this isn't anywhere near as inflammatory an attack as a direct attack on Israeli territory would be, there are still dangers inherent in this, aren't there? Oh, yes. I mean, I think we're going through some extremely tense times at the moment. Clearly, there's a huge pressure certainly coming from the Revolutionary Guards on the leadership in Iran for some sort of response against what has happened against the consulate in Damascus. And of course, we've been living in a sort of what I call a warm war, between Israel and Iran really for
I mean, years, if not decades. I mean, they've been really at it for a very long time. And clearly it's increased in intensity over the last 6 months. But, I think this has had its high and lows, and we're at the moment in a period of pretty intense crisis.
And, you talk about those divisions internally in Iran. Who is likely to win out, do you think?
Well, at the moment, the political landscape in Iran is really in the hand of the hawks, I have to say. So it's really a question of those who think that they should be maintaining some idea of what they call strategic patience, which is the normal sort of Iranian approach to these things. Let's take our time to further decisions, or those who want a much more immediate response. And the problem with this at the moment is that they're sort of facing this issue where there's an expectation that they will do something.
They have to be seen to be doing
so
something, don't they?
They're in a slightly problematic situation. They've sort of created a problem in a sense for themselves, and that their rhetoric is not really matching their action. So they now are being told, even by allies and others, that you really need to step up to the plate.
And what are their options if they step up to the plate?
Well, I think their options. I don't think there are any good options. I mean, this is the problem, because at the end of the day, also, they're very mindful of the domestic situation at home, and of course, the domestic situation at home in Iran is one of a very, very weak and failing economy.
Presumably, it's really critical what happens next in terms of the Israelis. Now, they have said Iran would bear the consequences of choosing to escalate the situation. What do you take that to mean?
Well, obviously, the Israelis want to maintain some degree of deterrence and want to put the Iranians off doing anything too reckless. But, what they're trying to send, I think, is a very clear message that if anything approaching what is being talked about actually happens, this will be a serious escalation, and the Israelis will take the necessary response, which would probably mean an attack on Iran itself, and that will obviously raise the stakes considerably.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a growing and pretty rare chasm between the US and Israel, but yet the threat of an attack from Iran sees President Biden coming out with some very, very tough talk. We support Israel. Iran will not succeed.
Well, that's absolutely right, and I think this is part of the problem, of course, is that what this whole dynamic has changed is actually the attitude of the United States towards Israel. There have been these frictions, and now all of a sudden, of course, Biden is showing unflinching support once again. So in many ways, it plays very much into Netanyahu's hands. And
in terms of how the wider world, because this will have implications, any attack on a shipping lane has implications for the rest of the world, doesn't it? How should they respond? How can they?
Well, I mean, the idea that the Iranians taking ships actually has been fairly sort of routine practice, I think, for a while now. So, I mean, I do think there needs to be a much, much firmer response, certainly in the Persian Gulf, towards these sort of activities.